Hi, everyone, and welcome to Keeping Curious. In this interview series, we're exploring some of today's big questions around financial crime and technology with help from experts in the field. I'm Catherine Peak, and I'm joining you today live from my Linkurious remote office. In this episode, I'm thrilled to welcome not just one, but two guests who I'm super excited to talk to. I'm happy to welcome Stephen Abbott Pugh, Head of Technology at Open Ownership, and Friedrich Lindenberg, founder of OpenSanctions. Now, before we jump in, I'd like to say a quick word on Linkurious, who's organizing this series. Linkurious offers the next generation of financial crime detection and investigation solutions to teams of analysts and investigators at Global 2000 companies, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations. Those include RIA Money Transfers or Concern Insurance, Deloitte, the UK's HMRC, and the ICIJ, who's behind world-class investigations like the Panama Papers. All right, let's get to it. So today we're talking about ownership and sanctions data. It's a hot topic for anyone investigating money flows, whether they're working in banking compliance or they're journalists looking under the hood of the global financial system. Historically, it's been hard to sift through that kind of data, which comes from many different sources that all format their data in different ways. So both Friedrich and Stephen are from organizations that are working towards better transparency in sanctions and ownership data. Just to introduce those organizations briefly, OpenSanctions brings together an international database of sanctions lists and lists of politically exposed persons, and converts those into a well-defined format for easy use and integration. And Open Ownership has developed the Open Ownership Register, which combines high-quality structured data from across jurisdictions to follow ownership trails wherever they lead. They've also developed the Beneficial Ownership Data Standard, the world's leading open standard for beneficial ownership data, sorry. All right, so I'm super happy to welcome both of you. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So I thought it'd be interesting to jump in by talking about open data more generally, what it is exactly, what it's generally used for, and who's using it. Stephen, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah. So open data, there's a thing called the open definition that helps define what openness is in terms of data, but it's generally data that anyone can access, modify, use, or do whatever they like with, without having to pay to access it or without having to give over their details, so that it's freely open and anyone can do what they like with it. There's some licenses that are often assigned to that data, so it can be just a kind of free, do whatever you like, or sometimes it can be that you have to say where you got the data from, so just attribution at least. And both of our organizations use kind of open licenses to publish the data that we collect or republish. And I think the general idea is the more data is available, the more people could easily and freely use it, the more creative uses there would be, the more opportunities, the more investigations people could do, or the more applications that people could build out to make use of that data and to realize its value. I mean, there's a huge range of people using open data. There's a lot of people who've been fighting for more open data for years and years. There's lots of work in the kind of sciences that publishes it. But I think what happens in our area, and especially around financial transparency, is it feels like there's never enough data, and we want to make the case that more of that should be open, so more of it can be used and help people to really find out what they want to find out from the data.
Mm-hmm. Friedrich, I don't know if you have anything to add to that definition.
Yeah, I think kind of, if you think about virtually any kind of analysis you want to do, whether it's in civil society or in business, most of the time kind of doing any meaningful research or even investigative use, it requires bringing data from together from different sources, right? And so I think what open data does intrinsically is to make that process transparent, right? So rather than having like one a big kind of dark pool of data and you kind of type stuff into your Bloomberg terminal, what you have is these small pieces loosely joined, right? Some of it straight out of the government agency that's publishing it, some of it maybe like prepared in an open data standard, the way you can then suddenly analyze data from like dozens of countries using the same tools, or even data that's further refined. And I think kind of that provides a new way of answering questions by accessing data in this kind of small pieces, loosely joined mode of data integration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As both of your organizations are working with open data, I was curious if you'd talk a little bit about some of the challenges you might be meeting today. And I of course, introduced your organizations a little bit in the intro to this episode, but if you have other things that you'd like to add, we're happy to hear them too. Do you want to start, Stephen?
Sure, yeah. So open ownership works with governments and data publishers all over the world to help with beneficial ownership transparency. So that's transparency about who owns and controls companies and other types of entities like trusts and other things like that. So what we're trying to do is a huge number of countries, about 130 countries so far, have promised more transparency about the people who register companies in those jurisdictions. And it's been a bit slow coming. Like a lot of them are slowly moving towards creating registers or changing their legislation and publishing things. And my team helps all the way along that path. So we help with the legislation and guidance, ultimately with the aim of having good quality data at the end that people can make use of. Ideally, that people could then combine, as Friedrich said, with data from other countries. So the problem we're trying to tackle with beneficial ownership transparency is that these ownership chains, the ones that you're really interested in, the ones that people are trying to get to the bottom of, often go through multiple countries. And so it becomes quite difficult to track. So my organization does that. We offer, as you mentioned, a few tools, but if people produce data in line with our data standard, we offer a bunch of tools and guidance and help that makes it a bit easier for them to use that data. And generally, a lot of countries have different problems, but some of them are interrelated. They want to follow money that's leaving their country and going to another country. They want to find out who the people are behind companies who are winning business from the government. There's some common issues, and there are lots of people are trying to tackle. And there's dozens of reports about why kind of the opacity of who owns companies is a really big issue, and how it facilitates corruption. So we think that some more beneficial ownership transparency can be helpful to try and tackle some of those issues.
Sure. I mean, there have been some really high-profile reports on the opacity in the international financial system. I mentioned ICIJ in the intro, but a lot of the reports really expose the problems behind the lack of transparency in the financial system.
Yeah.
How about you, Friedrich?
Yeah, I think very similar. So if you think about sanctions, right, depending on who you ask, there's maybe between 20 and 30,000 sanctioned people and companies in the world, right? Obviously, every country has its own list of who they particularly don't like or think has been causing havoc in the world. But bringing that together isn't actually that massive of a problem. Where it starts getting interesting is when you start to try and really follow the money, right? So obviously, Vladimir Putin does not walk into an office of Credit Suisse or now UBS on a Tuesday morning and open up a bank account, but rather there's middlemen, there's kind of shell corporations, there is all kinds of layers of secrecy and of obfuscation that happen between the companies that are being named by sanctions authorities, and then the vehicles that are actually conducting business, for example, to evade sanctions on trade with electronics or other kind of dual use goods with Russia at the moment, right? And so what we're trying to do a lot is to kind of say, okay, yeah, we have the core sanctions data, and now can we build outward from that and kind of include more and more entities that are also linked to those that have been sanctioned and should themselves be considered risk indications if they show up anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that kind of gets to my next question, which is about the overlap in sanctions and PEP data. So I mentioned to you before we went live that I was reading an article this morning about the implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act in the US. And one of the examples they gave in this article was talking about banks that were having a bit of trouble. They were worried about having trouble accessing ownership data, and how that would help make more difficult for them to track down businesses that had sanctioned individuals who were in the ownership chains. So I thought it was a really interesting example, and I was wondering if you could talk about how ownership data and sanctions or PEP data relate to each other and how they might be complementary in an investigation.
Yeah, I think kind of obviously you need to build these chains of like ownership, right? To say, here's a sanctioned entity or a company that is sanctioned or that is otherwise kind of involved in money laundering, has been known to be involved in economic crimes, right? And then kind of try and build the path of the money or the path of the agency towards where really interesting things happen, right? So and often that goes via normal jurisdictions, but also via secrecy jurisdictions, where for one reason or another, tracking that back becomes harder. Maybe one kind of very trivial example is Cyprus here in the European Union, right, where they sort of still make a very good living out of being particularly intransparent and making it easy, making it difficult, for example, for someone to ask not, okay, here's this company, who are its shareholders, but to ask the inverse question of like, here is a person, what companies are they a shareholder of, right? And then there's also this fun thing that can happen in open data world where you then combine this with other data. For example, customs data would be a really good example. In many countries, you can kind of get who is shipping what goods across the border, or procurement data where you then find out what goods and services governments buy. And if you think about that, right, there's like this very classic thing you can do, right, where you have on the one hand, a list of all the contracts that have been awarded by the government, right? Then you try to do company ownership for 1 or 2 or 3 layers. And then you see if anywhere at the end of this, there is by any chance a family member of a politician or a senior government official, which might be a kind of strong indicator that deal merits, for example, journalistic or auditory attention. And so I think that's kind of the fun of combining these different data sources is to be able to ask analytical questions that span across kind of these chains of intransparency.
Right. And we know the chains can be super complex.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, by design, right? Like
this of course.
Is not, they didn't grow this way in a farmhouse somewhere in southern France.
No.
And in terms of kind of around the beneficial ownership world, lots of countries tend to set thresholds or rules. You know, like if you have more than 25% of shares in a company, then you're a beneficial owner. But in terms of things about politically exposed people, some countries set different rules for them. So a lower threshold, like if you own 5% of this company and you're a politically exposed person, you have to declare it here, or there's certain special rules. And some of the countries that we've worked with, example like Nigeria and South Africa, they then have a challenge of connecting up all those data sets to do exactly what Friedrich just said. You know, one agency is collecting the data over here, another agency is collecting the data. So South Africa has 5 separate beneficial ownership registers collected by government in different places on trusts and companies and not-for-profits and things. So if you really want to say, does this person who happens to be the cousin of the president have lots of connections, you need to be able to link all of that data together. And in some places, there's special rules or legislation that's passed just for politically exposed people or just for high risk areas. So extractives, mining, oil and gas kind of, there's examples where, I think Ghana, for example, has a lower threshold. So if you own more than kind of 5% in an extractive company, then you have to declare it, for example.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I also wanted to ask you about the volumes of data around sanctions and ownership. I mean, Friedrich, you mentioned that there are about between 20 and 30,000 sanctioned individuals or entities right now. And I know that there's an ever increasing amount of data available around this. Ownership data by nature is always increasing. And so for both of you who are working this kind of data and trying to combine it and compile it, how do you manage the increasing volume of data in your databases? And then kind of a follow-up question that you can maybe answer at the same time. What does that mean for the folks who are analyzing the data when they have all the information to work through?
Yeah, I think kind of what I'm having a really good time with Open Sanctions is to try and build this out into sort of a layer cake, right? So if you think about it, okay, there's these 20, 30,000 people who are or people in companies who are sanctioned, right? You also want to maybe have like some understanding of PEPs, right? So you have a few 100,000 people who hold political positions in different countries. And then what we're trying to do, what kind of blows up the data, is to say, okay, we'll take each of these people that we know are interesting, that we know are in some way involved in either using budget money or involved in geopolitics in a funky way, and turn them into search queries into against all of the other databases that contain, for example, company ownership information or shareholder directorship information, and then build outwards, right? And then say, okay, now we start off with 100,000 things that we're interested in. Now we end up with 150,000 things we're interested in. Now let's do that another round, and then we start. We're at 170,000 things that we're interested in, and so that's sort of a fun game that we're playing. And kind of the technical challenge there is to then provide like full attribution back to, okay, this actually is like a watch list entry that comes from the US government. And this is something that is from, for example, Open Ownership's published data sets, and that is connected to a risk factor via these kind of paths. And that's sort of the data engineering that we essentially do.
Okay.
I think, Stephen, you've also been working a lot on, trying to build a data portal, a data kind of aggregator for beneficial ownership data.
Yeah, so we have a tool where we try to do this, that we're coming up against some of these challenges right now. So we have the Open Ownership Register, where we try to demonstrate how you can take full national beneficial ownership data sets from different countries. So we've got the UK, Denmark, Slovakia at the moment, and combine them. So there is examples where there's ownership that crosses between those countries, and also goes to, I think, we've got beneficial owners from 194 different jurisdictions, because they've declared that they are, from Barbados, but they own a company in the UK. And we also have kind of links out to lots of other places that are slightly more unknown, because can't follow them. Now, my challenge is that we're getting more and more data sets coming online. So the rules around this, the standards in general, are changing. The Financial Action Task Force has just revised what's called Recommendation 24, which is all about beneficial ownership of companies. And they're asking everyone to produce effective, adequate, up-to-date beneficial ownership information. So more and more countries collecting and publishing more and more data, refreshing it on a more regular basis. It starts to get to be a big challenge. So at the moment, I think in the Open Ownership Register, we've got beneficial ownership data on about 9 million companies and just under 10 million people.
Okay.
And we have about 25 million ownership or control statements. So how those people and companies are linked together, like the relationships there are between them. And the great thing about the recent work we've been doing with Friedrich's team is trying to take some of these challenges head on, which is that's a large kind of graph-like database that we want to combine with other things. And the problem is that most of those companies are straightforward, nothing to worry about. But it's the needle in the haystack approach. You need to have all of the data to be able to follow the chains, to link things together. So, this company might look fine, but if we go 5-6 stages up, you can find, a political donor who controls 25% of a whole sector in the UK. So we've got very detailed data from the UK, for example. We've got about 4.5 million companies from the UK, persons with significant control data. And we are just about to add France's beneficial ownership data, which will be another 3.5 million companies. So that's their national data set. And we've been working with Nigeria, who are producing their data. So yeah, my challenge is it's getting larger and larger. And actually the interesting thing about tools like Linkurious is that some of the data is getting so large that we need to have a kind of graph database approach to trying to query it, because it's just getting too large to do or to query in other ways. So yeah, it's a challenge. and it's the bills are going up and things are taking longer. But it's very exciting that it is something that more and more people are focusing on, and I think that's where the work and some of the projects we've been doing recently is really interesting, like how you can drill down just to find those 10,000 people, those 10,000 companies you really want to take a closer look at, rather than studying the 9 million people who are not doing anything wrong, we think.
Great. So go ahead, Patrick.
I also think what's really interesting is, how to actually manage that time aspect, right? Because that makes kind of holding the data much more complicated even still. One really, really interesting example in this is Russia, right? So they now have laws in place that make it okay for companies that have been sanctioned not to disclose very much about themselves in the company's registry at all, right? And so in a way, you want to kind of say, okay, there's Russia as of the 1st of February 2022, which was like a data set that was still somewhat usable, right? And now we have like all the stuff that's coming out since, which is kind of degrading in quality. And so in a way, we want to query 2 points in time in order to kind of be able to say, this is what they're claiming at the moment, who owns Gazprom, right? And this is kind of sort of the last vaguely safe data of like when the Duma hadn't made it entirely up for pickings. Mm-hmm. And so that's I think a really big challenge that we also need to dive into is how to deal with kind of information degrading or improving over time.
Sure. I'd love to ask you a little bit about analyzing that kind of data, but we had a question from the audience that I thought kind of worked into the data quality issue. So someone was asking about the rise in generative AI and if that poses a problem or if that's a worry for the quality of sanctions or ownership data.
Bridget?
I mean, I think kind of for us, it's not a big thing that we're worried about with the sanctions, obviously, right? What I am interested in is whether kind of these kind of large language models can be used for summarization of text, right? There's a lot of really, really interesting information about anti-corruption or about kind of corruption things that are going on, and most of it exists in a narrative form. And for us to kind of be able to say, hey, large language model, give me all the investigative reporting in the world summarized into a table that says who is a business partner, who's a family member, who's done, which companies have been accused of money laundering. That could be really interesting to kind of try and start using, definitely with kind of a massive human review process in place.
Right.
Yeah, and similarly, something like that, I can see the good and the bad. I can see that somewhat at the moment, let's say take the UK as an example, lots of registers don't have checks in place. They don't have a huge amount of money or a huge amount of people to check what's coming into them. And so you can go and pay £12 and set up a company in the UK called ABCDFYX, Z Limited, and you can pretty much do whatever. The legislation is currently going through Parliament in the UK to try and change that, but there's a challenge for lots and lots of places in the world that collect and publish company information that often there's not enough people checking it. And so if you have some kind of model or tool that could automatically generate realistic looking or sounding company names and people, there's a bad side of that someone could try and use it for nefarious purposes. And unfortunately, you talked about ICIJ, there's some big data sets out there that someone could use to kind of train, like what does if this is what a suspicious looking person looks like, what would an innocent looking person look like? But then on the other side of that, we work in a lot of, like Friedrich said, we work in a lot of environments where people are moving from paper to digitizing their information and trying to get that into a form of data they can use more easily. So I can imagine that some of this work is going to increase the quality of the scanning, all the kind of information you could use to build that. But yeah, would need a lot of checking, as Friedrich said.
Yeah, for sure. It's the problem across industries right now with that kind of AI, where it worked really well a lot of the time, and then every once in a while it goes off in a direction you really don't expect it to.
Yeah, and then in these kind of financial crime scenarios, right, someone loses their bank account, and that's really not a fun thing to go through. if all it is ChatGPT having a funny afternoon.
Yeah, and especially like so because obviously the data that we deal with has a lot of personal information in it. It has people's names, birthdays, family members, spouses, addresses, and every country has different rules about what can and can't be released in terms of beneficial ownership or sanctions. But the sanction information is very, very detailed. And so if you can have something that starts to take that and say, what would this person set up? You can start to very quickly think about worrying examples. And the worst thing is that a lot of companies, a lot of actual legitimate companies, do things that seem computer-like and seem difficult to. So they'll be called, innocent company, and they'll have. This happens all the time in the UK. They'll have innocent company 1, innocent company 2, innocent company 3, innocent company 4. They'll be really unimaginative when it comes to the naming of their companies. And then they have these structures you have to try and understand, and it's difficult to get through them. But how many people you need to understand that that's come from a human versus that's come from someone automatically just generating something is definitely a challenge.
Yeah. So we have time for a couple more questions, and I want to talk about. I mean, we've covered it a little bit, but talk a little bit about how to really dig down into the kind of data that your organizations are working with. So if you're looking to get to the bottom of a money trail or find out what's really going on behind a financial transaction, what does that process look like? And maybe you have some examples you can give of folks who've been working with your data and are leading investigations with it.
Yeah, I think one question that just came up that's really interesting with regards to that is kind of this question of like, okay, in the UK, for example, you can get really good data on company ownership or procurement, right? But what you don't know is who are the interesting people, right? And that's what I think is really interesting. It's like to me, the metaphor is kind of contrast imaging in medicine, right? Where you do a scan of a patient, and before you do that, you inject them with like a contrast agent. And that's how I think of these watch lists, right? They're investigative contrast agents saying like, oh, these people are interesting because they're on a sanctions list. These people are interesting because they hold political office. These people are interested because they've been known to be associated with economic crimes. Or these people are interesting because they've taken political influence, for example, by being donors. And so that's very much the kind of sort of problem that Open Sanctions is trying to solve. I think Joseph Smith asked here.
And just to build on that as well. So a project that myself and Friedrich have been working on recently that tries to help people in this space and actually uses Linkurious' technology is called Open Screening. So the Open Screening project it kind of came together over the last year, but it is a reaction to what's happened with Russia and Ukraine in the last year. There's a huge number more people who are sanctioned, and it's more important than ever to understand who they are, how they're connected, and what companies they might own, because the sanctions regimes have shifted so much that people who own a particular percentage of companies should be sanctioned. So if you're a boss here and you own a number of companies, those companies should also be sanctioned. And so you need to understand beneficial ownership, and you need to be able to follow those chains, and you need to also be able to link it to people who are in the data. So Friedrich's team had all this data on sanctioned individuals and politically exposed people, and we have data on beneficial ownership. And so what we've tried to do is marry the two of those together in the Open Screening tool, and then look for things that link companies or people, whether those are shared addresses, shared relationships, kind of linked to other companies as well. And so it's a free tool that anyone can go and use, and it's something we hope to work on and to grow as more and more data becomes available. As I said, we're coming across some challenges about the size of the data set. Right. I think we had 101 million different relationships or connections at launch, and some of those for infamous, heavily sanctioned people are very revealing. And it's really something that people need to grapple with. I mean, the different task forces that work on this have said that what they've spotted in the last year is oligarchs who are sanctioned, moving companies or trusts into the names of their children, moving it into different jurisdictions, all of these kind of things that some of which you can spot, some of which you can't. We have data where, thanks to some reporting from journalists in the UK, we were able to follow what they'd done to say, there's this guy who has moved a £2.5 million mansion in the centre of London into the name of his 15-year-old daughter. As just she's the beneficial owner. It was bought before she was born. It's kind of, there's red flags and things that should be raised. But it's a really interesting project. So you can look up everyone on there. So anyone who's in our data set, you can look up. And in some cases, there won't be many connections. So I had some fun looking up my parents. So I could see all of the people on their road who own companies. Okay. And they were actually quite interested in that. And for example, I can see all of the other companies that are registered at my cousin's accountancy firms, because that's where my dad has a company registered. So it's very interesting. You can look up anyone, but they'll be marked clearly if they're sanctioned. And it does a really fantastic job. And Friedrich can talk a lot more about this, but pulling together multiple data sets. So not just open sanctions, not just politically exposed persons data, not just our beneficial ownership data, which is produced in line with our data standard, but also other sources, other company registers. And yeah, Friedrich, shall I throw over to you to talk about that? Some of the other types of data.
I think kind of we've been building a lot of technology around kind of trying to model together different forms of anti-corruption data, whether it's company ownership or procurement or sanctions, etc. And we've kind of developed this data standard called Follow the Money. And I think with open screening, the project that Stephen was just talking about, we've also kind of had like a really interesting pattern of what I would call kind of incremental integration, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have, let's say, one of the core sanctioned individuals, right? You've got Boris Rottenberg, then we manually kind of review all the connections that show up in different databases, right? And we kind of manually say, these are all the same thing, the same person. Whereas once you get outside of that hot zone, kind of it starts making these kind of secondary links, saying, okay, here's like two entities where no researcher, no analyst has yet time to review whether they might be the same, but they share maybe the same name and the same address and maybe even the same registration number or something like that. And then basically the idea of kind of saying, okay, here's like a core set of entities that we A, know are interesting, but B, have also like manually verified all the connectivity between. And then there's also like this broader research pool where if you have a new lead, you can still go in there and see, oh, this might be connected to this other thing. And I think that's really, really like a nice investigative pattern.
Go ahead.
And just to really quickly link what we've been talking about, there's a question from Luke in the chat. So for people who don't know the kind of beneficial ownership space, the Court of Justice of the European Union issued a judgment at the end of November 2022, which basically found that they felt that the fifth anti-money laundering directive in the EU had gone too far by guaranteeing public access to everyone in the whole of the EU. Lots of member states hadn't actually implemented that. They hadn't done it yet, but that was what was in the directive. And what we saw as a result is a number of jurisdictions, mainly the ones who have more to answer for, to be honest, closed down their registers pretty quickly. So made it more challenging to try and track, different ownership chains, whether they be Russian or kind of influencing other places. So the Netherlands, Malta shut down their registers. What's really interesting for us is that it's actually caused a bit of a split in Europe. So for now, France has kept their data open. The UK has definitely said that it's going to keep its data open. It's not an EU member state anymore, but they've said that they don't feel that they need to be obliged under the same legislation to bring down their data. Latvia has just announced end of a consultation. It's going to keep its data open and public. Slovakia is going to keep its data open and public. So the way that it's being framed is that it's an anti-money laundering issue, but if countries have moved beyond anti-money laundering, so to look into public procurement or government officials doing guaranteeing integrity, they're still publishing their data. So it's kind of causing an interesting split at the moment. There's some good recommendations from the European Parliament that just came out recently about guaranteeing continued access for civil society organizations and journalists. So that's something that's going to form the 6th anti-money laundering directive, which will be debated in coming months. But Luke, just to answer your question, so are you able to still use the last version of the data you're able to access? Technically you would be able to. Legally, we have been advised that if the country decides to stop publishing its data, it would probably be advisable to take down some of those data sets and to not make them available anymore. But they may have been published in certain places or downloaded by people, which would mean that we wouldn't be fully in control of that process. But there's there's examples of countries that are planning on potentially stopping publishing their data. I mean, we would still say to them that all the evidence points towards more public access, realizing more value, people being able to use the data more. But it's different countries are reacting in different ways so far.
All right, we're coming up towards the end, so I'm just going to ask you both one last question. I think it's a nice one to end on. I want to ask, how do you see the role of your organizations in the future, and what would you say are your main objectives for the next couple of years? Why don't we start with you, Friedrich?
I mean, we're trying to provide building blocks, right? We're trying to provide building blocks for investigative journalists, for anti-corruption campaigners, and for business who want to kind of screen for sanctions in their customers or third parties. And to me, I would love to really go deep into building the most insightful data set on risk coming from money laundering, coming from kleptocracy, coming from all of these kind of real world phenomena that lie behind why an individual actor gets sanctioned, right? Kind of being sanctioned is the outcome of normally years of being involved in very, very funky business. And if we can kind of make a standard library of all the funky business actors and how they have proven themselves to be untrustworthy to do business with in the past, I think that can really help fight corruption and fight financial crime, and help us to have a world that it doesn't have mad dictators invading other countries quite as frequently.
We'd love that.
I'd love to see the legislation crack down on funky business. That would be great. So with our organization, as I said, we're moving from a position where this data has either never been released or it's only available commercially or kind of privately. And we think in the next 2 or 3 years, as I mentioned the Financial Action Task Force, but the World Bank, a huge amount of organizations are pushing for more and more data to become available around beneficial ownership. And we would like to help countries to publish good quality data. I mean, the shame would be of all of this work, of all these investigations, if then at the end you get information that people can't use and people can't make use of. So what we're hoping to do is at least double the number of countries that we've got that are publishing our data. So we're working with Latvia, who will be publishing their data to our data standard. We're working with Nigeria, we're working with South Africa, we're working with lots of countries to help make the case that the goal for them at the end should be having good quality data, because all of them want their governments to use it better, their law enforcement to use it better. And by the time we get to that stage, there are tools we can help them with, there are tools they can pay for, but having the good quality data in the first place that you can rely on is really key. So that's what we're working to develop. Working on the data standard that's still in active development, and welcome any feedback on that right now. So and also just to kind of show the value of this. We've got some case studies on the Open Ownership website, but the number of countries so far that have really published good quality data and then realized the value of it is maybe a handful, and we want to spread that and make sure more and more countries have good quality data that they can use, and it helps them achieve what they are trying to get done in the first place.
Yeah. All right. Well, exciting things coming down the road. Both open sanctions and open ownership, I hope. It's been really a pleasure having both of you on. Thank you so much. It's been super interesting. It's really a privilege to talk to both of you. Thanks for everyone who's joined us live, and we'll have more episodes that we'll be announcing in the near future. So I hope you'll tune in for those as well. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you both again, and take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.